Alright, so welcome back to the Race and Relationship series. Today is Thursday, so we're going to be talking about relationships in the Bible. And today we're going to talk about everyone's favorite subject, sex. So unfortunately, sex is something that, particularly for Christians, is viewed kind of as this taboo thing that we just don't really talk about, and we just say don't do it and we just leave it at that, right? And it kind of gives off this impression that sex is something that is like a taboo that we just shouldn't do, almost if it's like a sin to engage in sex or even desire to have sex. But the reality is, sex is not a sin, and the desire to want to have sex is not a sin either. Now, of course, like with anything, you can always take a good thing and pervert it and turn it into a bad thing, right? So sex was originally meant to be a good thing. It was meant to be a way to bind two individuals in a very intimate way who are already in a loving, committal relationship, right? Like literally, like, you know, when two individuals have sex or any sexual activity at all, right, oxytocin, this chemical, is released, and it is like a love/binding chemical that kind of attaches people together, or is supposed to bond individuals together. And so oftentimes when people have sex or any sexual activity and they feel as if they're like attached to that person, they mistake that feeling for love, when in reality they may not actually love that person on a very deep or personal level. It literally may just be purely physical, right? Just based on that experience that you just had and the chemicals that were exchanged. Okay, and so the reason why, well, one of the reasons at least, is because God wanted that sense of bonding to take place within a relationship that was already bound together in love and commitment and, you know, actual marriage. So a question that I've been kind of hearing and seeing a lot lately is this question of, okay, if God wanted us to wait until marriage to have sex, then why did He create us in such a way where we hit puberty at a very young age, at 12, 13 years old, and have all these sexual desires and urges, but have to wait, you know, until a later date, 10, 15, or even longer amount of years later, to actually be able to engage in those desires and actually have that sex, right? And I think that's an issue that we have here in the 21st century, but was not really an issue back in the biblical time periods. Because in the biblical time periods, what would happen is that people would actually get married at a younger age, at around 12, 13, 14, 15, years old. And we kind of look, we're like, what? What is a 12-year-old doing getting married? Isn't that a bit much? Okay, but we have to realize it's a different culture, different environment. And so it wasn't just like, okay, you're 12 years old, you're out the house, you're kicked out, get your own wife, get your own job, get your own house, get your own everything, and you're on your own. It wasn't like that, right? It was more of a communal support group that was around them the whole time. And so they would get married and they would have their family, the extended family, both the bride and the groom, supporting them and being that support system the whole time. So it wasn't just like they're on their own now, right? They were still part of the collective, the community, and they're supporting one another and helping one another and there for one another, right? And so while they were growing and while they were transitioning into adulthood, they had kind of like this mentoring support group system to help them along the way. So they weren't on their own trying to figure life out by themselves, but they had that system of support and counsel to help them along the way. So they weren't just kind of a 13-year-old man or 13-year-old boy or whatever trying to figure out life on his own, right? They had that support system around them. Okay, and it's funny how, in our modern day and age, we kind of laugh at this idea of, what, 13-year-old getting married? That's crazy. But yet, we're completely fine with a 13-year-old being in a relationship with completely fine with them having sexual activities and being engaged in sexual experiences, and even okay with them being pregnant and having children, right? We had a whole TV show, dedicated to teen moms and people who are getting pregnant as a teenager. And so it's funny how it's like we're okay with teens, having relationships and having sex and having babies, but yet we're not okay with them actually getting married. It's kind of strange. But I'm not necessarily advocating that we should, start, marrying off our kids at 13 years old. Because the culture that we're in now is not very conducive to that type of, like I said, that culture, it was very much inclusive, very much communal, very much a support system, right? So it was very hospitable, everyone looked out for another, everyone took care of one another. Now in this society, we don't really have that type of mindset. We don't really regard one another in that way. Everyone's kind of like every man for himself type of mentality, where we just want you to be independent and do everything by yourself, and there's no real culture of community, right? And so, yeah, having a 13-year-old getting married to another 13-year-old might be disastrous. Well, probably will be disastrous nowadays. And so we kind of have ourselves in this predicament where it's like, okay, well, we can't necessarily conform to the culture of the past, because it's gonna take a lot to try to transform a whole culture, you know what I mean? But at the same time, we still can't approach life the same way. We can't be having sex at 13, 14 years old as if we were in that society where we were getting married at a younger age and being able to engage in those type of relationships, because we aren't. So we're in this kind of weird middle ground where, we have strict puberty at a young age, but yet we have to wait until we're older and actually can support ourselves and take care of ourselves before we can actually engage in marriage and engage in sex. And so that period of time, that 10, 15, however many years between those two time periods, is obviously years of struggle for many people, right? To maintain, that self-control and not giving to sexual temptation. And so what can we do to actually, remain, sexually pure? Now, I don't have all the answers. I'm in the same boat as everyone else trying to figure this whole thing out. But I can at least try to offer a few principles that I think can be helpful in making life a little bit easier when it comes to this issue. So the first thing I would say is be mindful of what you're allowing into your mind, right? Because if you're constantly being exposed to sexual content and sexual media and, movies, TV shows, music, video games, whatever it may be, that's, nowadays almost everything is saturated in sex, and so it's kind of hard to stay away from it. But if you're constantly kind of saturating your mind with that stuff, of course, it's going to become more and more of a desire, and eventually that desire is going to turn into action, and that action is going to turn into a habit, and it's going to just go down this very steep path down to destruction. So you want to be mindful of what you're allowing in here, because that's pretty much where it all starts. It all starts in here, and then it manifests itself through other ways. So be mindful of the media and content that you're consuming, because if you're being oversaturated with sexual content, then of course it's going to feed just more into the already natural sexual drive that you have. You know what I mean? So it's just going to make things worse. Okay? It's not going to help you control it. It's just going to, if anything, make it go even more out of control. So be mindful of what you're allowing into your mind. And also, you want to make sure you're not putting yourself in a situation where you know that you can probably fall into sin or temptation, right? Probably the most classic example of this is, don't be alone with someone that you know you're physically attracted to, right? I mean, you might be able to handle it the first time, second time, maybe even up to the 10th time. But if you continuously put yourself in that situation, eventually you're gonna fall, alright? Trust me, I've been there, done that. I thought I was strong, I could handle it, but no, okay? Don't be too boastful, don't be too cocky, right? You might be able to handle it a few times, but it's not going to be all the time, right? At some point, you will fall, right? So don't put yourself in that situation where you know you can fall into temptation or fall into sin, because you're just setting yourself up for failure, all right? And yeah. And the third thing I would say is pay attention to little details, because oftentimes we focus on the big problems, like, oh, I'm gonna stop having sex, or I'm gonna stop watching pornography, I'm gonna stop masturbating, or we focus on these big problems, these big issues, but we neglect to pay attention to the little details, like the glance at someone's cleavage, or the second glance when she walks by, or whatever it is. Like, those little things that we do, they do matter. We think that, oh, it's just a small thing, it doesn't matter, but it builds up slowly but surely, and it becomes a wall. You know what I mean? Like, it's little pebbles here and there, but as it accumulates, it becomes this huge wall that's very hard to then overcome, right? So yeah, focus on the big boulders of sex and masturbation and all this other stuff, but also pay attention to little pebbles that can eventually build up to become a huge boulder or a huge wall that can kind of stand in a way and be a hindrance to us, right? So, and really it all boils down to just training your mind, right? Training your mind to not just immediately lust after someone, to not just immediately objectify someone, not just immediately sexualize everything, not just immediately fall into lust, right? Train your mind to have self-control and really to be able to see people as people. You know what I mean? Like, not just seeing them as, means to an end, but as actually a living human being, just like me, right? And so, yeah, these are pretty much the tips that I got. Like I said, I'm not going to solve the world's problems in one video, but I think these can actually help in a way to make life a little bit easier, especially when it comes to dealing with this void in between when we have these urges and when we can actually engage in them, right? Sex is not a sin, and it should not be viewed as this taboo thing. But of course, like I said, with all good things, we can always pervert it into a bad thing. And so we need to just be mindful and be careful not to pervert what was originally meant to be good into something that's bad, right? So that's pretty much it for today. I will see you next week.
Thank you.